Jade, tell me the hype is real on this one. I need it. I need it so bad.
So, I think the hype is mostly real. Try and guess my review score. We'll start with that.
I hope it's a 9. Your face is telling me it's more like an 8.
It's an 8. It's an 8.
Okay.
But I will not be surprised by the time people are watching or listening to this. The reviews will be out. I could see this raking in quite a few 9s and 10s, much like Split Fiction did.
Yeah.
Not Split Fiction. It Takes Two did.
It Takes Two, right?
But I think this game is absolutely wonderful at its best, but also quite tedious and predictable at its worst.
Predictable. That's surprising. So I've played a fair bit of this. I've done 2 preview sessions. And I was really impressed with the variety from what I played. But they gave me like just tiny sections of a bunch of different levels. So I haven't played any like full levels beginning to end. So I'm surprised to hear you say that it's predictable. Is that the story? Or I mean, obviously the story.
Yeah. So much like It Takes Two before it, Hazelight is using this concept as an excuse to throw as many experimental and unique gameplay mechanics and ideas at you as possible.
Yeah.
And Split Fiction absolutely does that. Like every single level, as you probably know from playing a bunch of it, they give you a couple of unique abilities, and those kind of inform what you end up doing for the next like couple of hours or so. And that's the case here. Like there's a level where you pick up a dragon egg, and in the trailers it shows this growing sequentially throughout this hour and a half level at least, and each iteration of that dragon has different abilities, and it's got quite an innovative narrative through line. There's stuff like that where you're always having to learn and adapt and apply these abilities while relying on like this bedrock of engaging but simplistic platforming across like the sci-fi and fantasy settings. But I will say there are a couple of levels that do hinge on outstaying their welcome more than others.
Yeah, when you said an hour and a half for the dragons, that's for a co-op game. That's a long sequence.
There is one level, I think it's not Neon Revenge, it's something else, where it's very much like a generic like space marine fantasy. You're given each character is given a set of laser guns, and they are used to both defeat enemies and activate a variety of switches and stuff like that. And it's cool, like it's a great concept, and you'll be solving puzzles and firing these switches to like almost a rhythmic pace to get through new areas. But there did come a point where we did a big boss fight, and then this level just kind of carried on and dropped us into another sequence with jetpacks and using these guns again to solve similar puzzles. And I was like, oh, okay. And combining that with already knowing or having a very good hunch about where this narrative was going, you were kind of just like, oh, okay, I'd love to see the next idea now.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Stacey about this, who's playing through it at the same time.
Stacey Henley.
Yeah, big up. And we both agreed where it's almost hesitant to introduce clever ideas at the same pace as It Takes Two, but I suppose that's also a consequence of wanting to tell an almost more heartfelt and introspective story with these two characters, because It Takes Two was kind of excellent, obviously, but it was about this couple divorcing, going through like a miniature version of their house, like bees nest and stuff like that, and it was very absurd and surreal at times. But one of the wonderful things about Split Fiction is every level, the big concept about this game is, oh, it's sci-fi and fantasy. Like the two key characters, Zoe and Neo, one is a fantasy author in training, well, not in training, like a wannabe author, and one is a sci-fi author. And you can risk putting yourself in a box with that concept, going one level's going to be sci-fi, one level's going to be fantasy. But it doesn't do that, because despite the narrative being quite predictable and dry in a lot of places, a lot of the level design and the mechanics and the characters you meet are kind of reflections of what these characters are going through, which I don't want to spoil too much, but Neo's father has cancer, and there's a lot of stuff about her struggling to pay for the treatment, or like these health corporations sucking away life from like this person that she loves, or with Zoe, like she alludes to her sister a lot, and you know that something bad has happened there. And there's a lot
Mm.
of great storytelling and
Okay.
level design incorporated within that, where it's like, oh, okay, like the dragons I mentioned earlier, you see them grow from this baby dragon to this large flying dragon, and then at the end of the level, Zoe has to let them go, and the game very deliberately parallels that with her letting go of a sense of guilt that she feels over something terrible that happened in her life. So I think that does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to some of the mechanics or level
Mm.
design veering unpredictable. It carries you through, but like It Takes Two or all of Hazelight's games, I'd say, I love to describe them as like hokey but heartfelt. Like, and
Right.
that kind of,
Yeah,
if you know what I mean, like It Takes Two, there was a
definitely.
lot of like, oh, they could have written that line differently and stuff like that. There's a lot of that here, especially uh, on the outside, but I'll get to that in a little bit.
Mm. Well, that definitely rings true from what I remember from It Takes Two. First of it sort of overstaying its welcome a little bit when it comes to some of the levels and some of the mechanics. I
Mm.
felt like that game was a little too long, and sometimes when I talk to people, they say they didn't finish it because it felt like it was too long, at least for a co-op game. But I'm happy to hear that the themes actually have some depth to them. I think
Yeah.
that's what I expected to be the weakest part of the game, was like the characters, the writing, the storytelling. But would you say that there's been some growth from It Takes Two there? There's been some
I
evolution.
think so, because I
Mm.
thought It Takes Two, they should have just gotten divorced and not like had this big conversation. But obviously, that game ends somewhat ambiguously, and they do grow throughout. And
Yeah.
this game is very much the same. Like Zoe and Neo, they turn up to this place called Radar Industries, where they're promised that they'll get published, but in reality, this corporation is putting them into a simulation to steal all of their ideas, which the
Hmm.
game very much frames as this sort of critique of the current state of generative AI and how they're
Yeah.
stealing ideas from people, which is ironic because the game's published by EA. But
Right.
like, the less said about that, the
Are we the
better. But
baddies?
yeah, I think there's a trophy called "Are We the Baddies?"
Oh my god.
So, but yeah, when Zoe and Mio are first thrust into this situation together, they hate each other because
Right.
Mio's very brash and confrontational and emotionally closed off because of what she's been through, while Zoe is very happy-go-lucky and enthusiastic and overbearing. But it becomes clear very quickly that that's kind of a shield to stop people getting in, much like it is for Mio. But with each level, they begin to appreciate like the nuances of their different storytelling habits and like love for different genres when initially they were very ignorant towards it.
Mm.
So that like womanly friendship is a core theme throughout the game, and unlike the two lead characters in It Takes Two, I by the halfway point I was in love with these characters. I was rooting for them. I wanted them to make it out and be happy. And yeah, there is a genuine amount of growth there where you get to the big emotional scenes, which I won't spoil, but
Mm.
at the start of the game, Mio just would have walked away from Zoe when she was going through this stuff. But there's some points where I was playing through it with my sister and my brother-in-law, and we were like watching in quite stunned silence at some of these emotional scenes, going, "Oh
Wow.
wow, they like really nailed this and hit it off." And as someone who, that's one of the Zoe's key themes is like sibling death, and having lost my brother, I was like, oh okay, like whoever was behind this clearly understands what that is like and how
Mm.
you might go about confronting it, or in Zoe's case, ignoring that guilt and that grief until you're forced to confront it in this very extraordinary circumstance.
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't expect that. Because from my experience, what's impressed me so much about it so far is, uh, one, just how good all of the, I almost said like imitations, but the way that it like tackles a genre, though it's like, okay, now it's a skateboarding game. Okay, now it's
Yes,
a Metroidvania, and every time it switches to a new genre, it feels great.
it
It
does it
doesn't,
so well.
yeah. And then the second thing was just how all the ways it plays with the split screen genre. Like all the
Yes.
creative ways, and it feels like that's the biggest evolution from It Takes Two and from their past games, is how experimental it is when it comes to how can we have two players play on the same screen. It's just constantly
Yeah.
moving that line and creating new ways to approach it that I just thought was so cool.
They do that brilliantly in this, more so than It
Hmm.
Takes Two. You're obviously it's split screen, like that's the kind of game it is, but it will often shrink or expand to focus on certain players or certain mechanics in a way where you're like, okay, even if you're playing as two different people, you know where your focus should be in terms of a puzzle sequence. Or there are great moments where like a door will open or you'll sit on a bench and the seam in the middle of the screen will come into the middle and then just erase, so you're both playing
Yeah.
on the same plane. Or there's quite a few sequences actually where Mia might be hacking into something and all of a sudden it's just a single screen and you'll be doing something, you'll be pressing buttons to influence the environment while the other player plays through it, like you'll be lifting platforms or solving a puzzle or fighting enemies. And it doesn't just use split screen as like a genre or a means of play. It incorporates that very notion into some of its puzzles and its combat encounters and its level design, which is so clever.
Yeah.
I almost want to put down a spoiler warning to talk about something. Like, is that something
I
we can do?
I know. I don't think we should. I think we should dance around it because I know what you're going to talk about. I've seen some of this, some of the like the stuff
Yeah,
in the last couple of levels,
it
and
is wild. That's all I'll
it
say.
is, yeah. The things it does with the idea of split screen is like mind blowing.
I was like
In the end of the
visibly,
game,
like audibly going like, "What?"
I can't believe this.
Like,
Yeah, yeah,
I do think, without saying it specifically, during that particular sequence, it's rushing towards the end and intertwining a lot of that with a boss battle. So
hmm
I would almost love to see Hazelight explore that
yes,
interdimensional idea more in a different game or an expansion, because it does not reach its full potential here. I don't think it is
yeah,
extraordinary and something I've never seen in a video game before, and it almost feels like the crescendo of what Hazelight's been doing with this genre for a long time. But it's so
absolutely,
clever
yeah,
to the points where you're like, how did they do that? And
yeah.
very
That's
few
such a good
games
point.
instill that feeling anymore.
It's like this is what Hazelight has been building to all these years, was like
Yeah.
what they do at the end of this game. Yes, but you're taking some points off, so talk to me a little bit more about where it misses the mark a
Oh, I've got to be mean now.
bit.
So I think, as we discussed a little bit previously, some of the levels are quite visually generic and uninspired. It's hard to tell
Mm,
if that's the point or it's just like, oh, okay, they want you to be a space marine to do all of this cool shit with lasers
there's
and stuff.
there's almost this like Alan Wake element of like these are hack writers with bad ideas kind of thing,
No,
right?
right? Because they kind of keep envisioning these concept of like dragons and fantasy lands, and it's like I had people watching me going, "That's very Lord of the Rings, isn't it?" And it's hard to tell if
Yeah,
that's the point or if it's
'cause
not. But if it
they're
still has
constantly
me
scooping
thinking,
ideas. There's like they
"Oh
do
yeah,
like
there's so many homages in this, it's crazy."
well, a lot of it is clearly an homage. Like you do, I remember in one level you do an Assassin's Creed Leap of Faith, and it plays the eagle sound. So
Oh, and she
clearly,
literally says, "Talk about a leap of faith" when they get out of the
yeah, yeah.
hay.
So clearly, it's like, oh, you're doing an homage to Assassin's Creed, but the rest of the game is it's all just like generic ideas from sci-fi and fantasy that you've seen.
Yeah, when that generic like visual execution combines with levels or mechanics that are cool at
Mm,
first, and you're like, "Oh, cool, I'm enjoying playing around with this." But when that level goes on for 2 hours, it's kind of like, "Oh wow,
right.
okay, this needs to buzz off."
Let's keep it
Otherwise, it's kind
moving.
of. But I will say one of the things that does an excellent job at breaking up the monotony of certain levels is the side stories, which are
Mm,
essentially bite-sized levels in themselves. They take like 10, 20 minutes, if that, and they are pretty much Hazelight's excuse to be very carte blanche with what they're doing. It's like, oh, we're working within this sci-fi and fantasy framework, but these side levels are just an excuse for you to be a pig who farts around the world for
Yeah,
ages.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
there's a really wonderful one where Zoe is narrating a storybook, and it's essentially a 2D platformer in the style of something like Limbo or Sable, and she's narrating what
Mm,
happens. And there's some sequences like, "What weapon do you want to pick?" And you walk up to it, and it gives you this weapon, or it asks you to fight. No, there's one moment in this particular level where I think it's a, "Do you want to fight like a crab, a duck, or something else?" And I picked a crab, and it, speaking of video game references, so it's like, and then they summoned a giant enemy crab, and you hit its weak point for massive damage. So it's clearly leading into that stuff, but
mm,
it's cute and honest. Where, but if it was executed in a different way without this much reverence, it might have been cringe and unnecessary.
mm.
But there's also one side level which is basically SSX tricky. Like, I don't know how else to describe
Right.
it. It's like Amped 3, but you're doing a score attack, competing against the other player, while this kind of dying star is, and this space station is erupting around you, and it's
Yeah.
incredible. Like, the way this game plays with like visual scope, but still makes you in control while you're moving around that environment is quite extraordinary. And these side stories just give them permission to do that. Like, there's another level where you're kind of trying to get closer to a dying sun to activate this machine so it gets sucked into a black hole and doesn't destroy the planet you're on. Just lots of little things like that, which, as you said, in It Takes Two, they're constantly introducing these new mechanics and these new visual ideas. I'd say Split Fiction sometimes falls short within the story, sci-fi and fantasy story levels, but they
Mm,
pick up that slack in the side stories a lot of the time, because you never
cool.
know what you're going to get. And I think there's also another side level, I won't spoil anymore, this is the last one, where you're just Teeth wandering through this fantasy land full of sweets, and then you get to the end and you have to fight an evil dentist, and it's very grim and grotesque, but it's so lovely, and it tells you a
Yeah.
lot about these characters. And I think that might be my favorite bit about it, because as a storyteller myself, and a lot of people who play this game will be, it's like, oh yeah, that is, they're sometimes ashamed of the stories you tell or the stories you write,
Mm.
but they kind of like spend this whole game analyzing that and what it means to tell those stories in the first place. And I think that's quite special.
Oh, I love it. I love all of it. Yeah, your critique makes total sense. I felt very similar about It Takes Two. I felt like it just
Yeah.
wasn't quite paced the way I would have liked. It overstayed its welcome in some levels. I wanted to get to the next thing, and I felt like I was stuck in some levels for way too long. And it sounds like that's still something that Hazelight is.
And the writing is still like, as I said, hokey and heartfelt.
Yeah,
And it gets
hokey
to a
and
point where I'm
heartfelt.
like, oh, I know where this is going. And
Yeah,
then when you get there, but a lot of stories are quite hokey and heartfelt and clumsy, but if the most emotionally poignant moments land and you believe in the characters and what they're going
right,
through, a lot of that other critique kind of ceases to matter. And that's
right.
the case here. Like, the big moments land, and that's the most
Yeah,
important thing, because compared to the other two in It Takes Two, these are much more likable characters, because they're designed to be. Like, they're very
right.
brash, but they're clearly just like 20 somethings trying to make something of themselves.
It's so cool. I'm so glad Hazelight exists and is making games like this that no one else is making.
I
So
know, like, I'm curious. I'll pose this question to you. What do
yeah,
you think they'll do next? Do you think this is like their last big couch co-op thing, or do you think they'll just keep iterating on this? 'Cause
I think they're just gonna
genuinely
keep.
don't know.
I think they're just gonna keep doing split screen co-op stuff. Yeah, I think
Mm.
they found so much success with it, and they're just gonna keep doing it. And I'm glad. I'm glad they are. Until they get boring, and it doesn't seem like they are yet.
Oh, I've got an idea.
Hmm.
Right. So imagine if their next game, you start it as a pair of twins, and then you play through their entire lives, but you get
Oh,
older.
yeah,
That's a cool idea, isn't it?
I like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not sure how
it could
much
be
fun
anything.
playing like Grandma and Grandpa would be, but
It won't be fun, Eric. That's the point. Because they'll die at the end. But
oh,
like,
now you're describing a David Cage game.
no, no, no. They'll Benjamin Button it at the end or something. I don't know. But again, there's so much potential in that concept. Because I remember when they announced Split Fiction, it was like, oh, that's such a cool idea.
Yeah,
But they could do that again. And Joseph Fares, like, I've spoken to him a few times over the years, and like, he just seems like a well of ideas, and he'll just keep doing stuff like this. because
100%.
he's got the
Yeah.
team and he's got the creativity. But yeah, like despite my 4 out of 5 score, it's like a very generous 4 out of 5. Just taking that critical edge to it, like we have to a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's like definitely a recommend, right?
Oh, hard recommend, especially because you can just buy it and play with anyone because it gives you 2 copies. Like,
Yeah, that's a nice part. Yeah.
One thing I will note as a closer is It Takes Two was quite. You could play it with anyone, but if you played it with like a non-gamer, they'd have a hard time wrapping their heads around some of the like mechanics and concepts.
Mm.
This is the same. I'd argue it almost veers in the hardcore direction a little more, where you'll need to be pretty reactive with what you do.
It's faster.
And the mechanics changed. It's a lot faster, especially the platforming. Like, because you have like a dash and a grapple as default, but it's also very forgiving because you could take 2 hits before you die, but you could mash triangle to respawn, and it's like I played it with my sister, and like we didn't have very much trouble getting through it.
Mm. Yeah, I noticed that too. It did seem harder than It Takes Two, and I feel like people that played It Takes Two probably have developed the skills they need for this one. It's not hard,
Become gamers,
but it's harder. Yeah, they have become gamer.
I'd say that's accurate. It's not hard, but it's harder.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. If you would like to read Jade's full review, it's linked down in the description. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and visit us at thegamer.com. That's The Gamer. No spaces.
No